Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Open your eyes, look up to the skies and see. I'm just a poor boy, I need no sympathy, 'cause I'm easy come, easy go, little high, little low. Any way the wind blows doesn't really matter to me. And that's all I have to say about that. Ordinarily, when people have a movie quote or internet meme replete with terrible impressions spring-loaded for every conceivable situation, it tends to give the impression of a kind of Frankenstein's monster who, having recently slouched slimily forth from his birthing chamber and finding himself abandoned by his creator, undertakes his education by huddling beneath the window of the nearest perpetually unemployed binge watcher. And despite my general disdain for vocabularies comprised entirely of stock phrases from A Tourist Guide to Sedentary America, I find Forrest Gump's scenic little bus stop immensely useful as a frame of reference for helping us get a handle on the scintillating, silhouette-y psychosis that is Bohemian Rhapsody. At all levels of interpretation, a detailed explication of the song's lyrics is much less cranium-shattering when we conceive of the Prelude's reflections on the nature of reality as the chronological end of the story, something that makes more sense once we know how everything comes together. Ergo, we will hold off on our analysis of the prologue until all the facts are in. Like Forrest Gump's bench-bound captive audience, we must picture ourselves beside the song's narrator, hereafter referred to as Poor Boy, patiently waiting for him to work through his windy musings on the difference between real life and fantasy, before following him on a mostly cohesive journey through the criminal justice system. Poor Boy kills a man, departs his family and friends, endures the shame of a trial, the terror of imprisonment, and ultimately finds self-justification and perhaps even escape. And just as we cannot fully grasp the genius of Mama's life is a chocolate box metaphor until after experiencing the tectonic social shifts of the 60s and 70s through our kind-hearted simpleton's eyes, we cannot apprehend the nature of the landslide until Poor Boy reveals what has led him to adopt this any way the wind blows philosophy. At this point, it just sounds like he's coming to terms with the fact that he blew his life savings on a particularly dismal piece of real estate. With the song's crime and punishment story arc clearly on display, we're left to wonder what it might mean to dig any deeper into this text. And with harmonies, flourishes, and contrapuntal gut punches like these, Freddie Mercury could have written a song about an especially compelling meal at the Olive Garden, and the song would lose little of its appeal. Lasagna, no, I will not let you go, lasagna. Oh, Margarita, Margarita. We are certainly free to leave the literal as it lies, but asserting that Bohemian Rhapsody is merely a story about the consequences of crime is tantamount to claiming that Jesus' parable of the sower is merely advice on proper seeding techniques, that Aesop's tortoise and the hare is merely commentary on animal sportsmanship, and Orwell's Animal Farm merely a smear campaign launched against a couple of uppity pigs. Reading such stories as allegorical parable, and knowing that some real-world lesson or application is forthcoming, gives our strained, gnat-like 21st century attention spans reason to engage with an otherwise silly or implausible scenario. And I would think that we are similarly disinclined to care about Rhapsody's ultimately unrepentant murderer. Much like the Book of Revelation, with its cryptic references to a many-headed beast rising ominously out of the sea, this is one of those texts that just leaves us with a sense that there's something more there, hard as it is to ascertain exactly what that something is. One of the more interesting readings of Revelation has us understanding it as the Apostle John's way of symbolically smuggling messages to the emerging Christian church amidst the looming persecution of Rome. But what tasty piece of contraband has poor boy smuggled to us, secreted away in some obscene cavity beneath that orange jumpsuit? If we are to read Rhapsody as allegory, what does poor boy bring to us that is like the word of God through the seed, that is like the tortoise's slow-burning diligence, that is like Orwell's vision of the Stalinist regime as expressed through a couple of bipedal swine? Stealing yourself for perhaps the only thesis in history to contain the words bacon and horsepill, poor boy's mama just killed a man sob story seems to me to be a strip of greasy bacon wrapped around the hard-to-swallow horsepill of human persecution. Shorn of confusing metaphors, reading Rhapsody as a parable about the subjective experience of persecution helps us to account for details that are confusing unless we are willing to peel back the song's topmost literal layer. But in what ways does the text permit such a reading? What clues does it leave us that we should read it this way? This is a question we will be better equipped to answer as we work through the text, but for now, the title will get us on our way. A bohemian is someone, usually of artistic or literary leanings, who leads an unconventional life and flouts social expectations. A rhapsody is a song with a free-flowing structure, which this one certainly is, since it clearly doesn't retreat into a chorus every 4 to 8 lines. Translating the words Bohemian Rhapsody into plain English, we end up with something like free-flowing song about a person who disregards social standards. With a reminder that we'll be returning to the prologue at the end of the video, let's think about how the first verse might point us toward this theme of the social other. Mama just killed a man, put a gun against his head, pulled my trigger, now he's dead. Mama, life had just begun, but now I've gone and thrown it all away. Mama, ooh, didn't mean to make you cry. If I'm not back again this time tomorrow, carry on, as if nothing really matters. Keeping our reading anchored in the literal, this is our entry point into the narrative proper, with poor boy coming clean about his gruesome crime, with a pity party thrown exclusively in honor of Mama and himself, and with his unnamed hole-in-the-head victim left to rot uninvited in whatever anonymous ditch poor boy dumped his body. We expect the soulless eyes of the sociopath to sit parked above that mewling frown. But a sociopath does not necessarily a nihilist make, and though he lacks remorse for the Jackson Pollock gray matter painting he left splattered on the wall, poor boy is clearly devastated that his full ride to Princeton is now a no-go, and that Mama might have to squirt a few tears, coming to terms with the fact that her son is about to become his burly future cellmate's brand new baby blanket. And then there's the allegorical level. Enlarge and emphasize a few key details, and the first verse, movement, chapter, or whatever you want to call it, tells a very different story. Being close readers sensitive to irregularities in phrasing, there's something just a little off about pulled my trigger, where we would ordinarily expect pulled the trigger. In the interest of narrowing the scope, think about any song in which triggers are pulled, the majority of which are probably rap songs, at which point I will defer authority on this matter to those more qualified. My hilariously scant knowledge of rap and hip-hop music notwithstanding, I guarantee that under the unfortunate circumstances in which triggers must be pulled, it is the trigger, not my trigger, as the ownership implied by the word my is usually assigned to the gun rather than the trigger. This seems hardly worth our attention, but the close reader knows that there is a world of difference between the connotations of thee and the connotations of my, with the two-letter word suggesting much more ownership and intimacy than its three-lettered cousin. It's hard to make sense of this linguistic peculiarity without more context, but it is a cue to keep our eyes peeled for any language that would inform why our narrator asserts such ownership over and intimacy with this trigger. The close reader will also notice a pointed contrast between "as if nothing really matters" and a comparable phrase found in the prologue. In the narrative present, Poor Boy suggests, though in more idiomatic terms, that nothing really matters, whereas here he requests that Mama pretend as if nothing really matters, which implies that something, though certainly not the fully intact cranium of that guy, really does matter to the narrator. So it's already been spoiled for us that by story's end, Poor Boy will metamorphose from sociopathic caterpillar into a fluttering, full-blooded nihilist. The only mystery that remains is how he got there. So what might this confession and teary farewell suggest at the allegorical level? We can work it out by starting with the idea that the man Poor Boy killed was the falsest part of himself. He pruned away all remnants of the posturing teacher's pet so that his inner bohemian could grow with all the ferocity of a man-eating kudzu plant. But mamas tend to like it when their babies toe the line. So Poor Boy's break with his false self is not without its consequences. At the allegorical level, Mama ain't crying over the fact that her son's a murderer. She's crying because her mind's reeling at what a suburb full of doctors, lawyers, and engineers is going to think when her son announces at the upcoming block party that he intends to embark on a fulfilling career as a mime. Conceived in this way, my trigger looks a lot less like the trigger of a gun and more like the epilepsy-inducing trigger of too many hours spent watching giant anime robots shoot lasers at each other. Something in our narrator just snapped, resulting in the death of a living person at the literal level and the death of a living lie at the allegorical. Perhaps this is why he subtly asserts ownership over and intimacy with this trigger, the possessive pronoun being an "if you blink you'll miss it" way of indicating that the trigger that really matters is the one attached to his brain rather than his gun. Pull the trigger of a gun and something's probably gonna die. Pull someone's psychological trigger, and you may well end up with a different person on the other side. We're not told anything specific about the nature of this trigger, but we do know that there's no going back. So far, we have two stages of persecution, a sort of schism with the false self, and the resultant fallout when the family doesn't approve. Let's see what other cleated kicks to the crotch, existentially speaking, await our bohemian narrator in the next verse. Too late, my time has come, send shivers down my spine, but it's aching all the time. Goodbye, everybody, I've got to go. Gotta leave you all behind and face the truth. Mama, any way the wind blows, I don't wanna Just as poor boy's bohemian ways estranged him from his family, it seems he's got to find himself some new friends as well. This would be equally true if he were a murderer amidst non-murderers or an aspiring street performer in a land of snobby Ivy League types. And just as the time has come for our narrator, the time has also come to pay our dues to the scantily clad, pirouetting elephant in the room. Yes, take one look at Freddie Mercury's biography, and you'll be suppressing a shout from the rooftops that the song simply cannot be about anything other than his flamboyant and complicated sexuality. Nobody will argue against the notion that Mercury in his day was something of a sexual bohemian. But me, being the fan of broader strokes that I am, see nothing in the text that compels us to read it as a parable about sexual and only sexual persecution. We are not unjustified, if we are so inclined, in reading a line like "bodies aching all the time" as poor boy's repressed and aching desire to leap swooning into the arms of the neighborhood handyman, only to be drugged before the sexual Sanhedrin and decried as a living affront against Darwin's evolutionary imperative to be fruitful and multiply. It was Darwin that said that, right? If you insist on reading it this way, have at it, as sexual persecution was and is a harsh reality for many across the globe, and may well be the mental template that Mercury was working from as he penned these lyrics. But it will be at your insistence that Rhapsody is only about sexual bohemianism, not at the insistence of the text itself. Personally, in addition to the aforementioned poor boy as mime reading, I sometimes find myself imagining the narrator as a young, poetic soul in some far-off dystopian future, looking for a place to stare contemplatively into the eye of God, only to be seized by a progressive militia of androgynous androids and drugged before the cryopreserved brain of Stephen Hawking on charges of superstition. But that's just me. Once our consciousness has been alerted to the possibilities of parable, it doesn't take much work to reconcile the literal with the allegorical here. Emerging from the bubble of your little Sesame Street community and into a frighteningly unfamiliar world is likely to send shivers down the spines of murderers and mimes alike. Within the fiction of the story, the truth that poor boy faces is the prospect of execution or life imprisonment. For us outside the story, it's a portrait of a person staring unflinchingly at a reflection of his true bohemian self while bracing for the stones that family and former friends are bound to let fly. Almost touching in a Norman Bates kind of way, poor boy cries out for mama one more time with the "any way the wind blows" verbal motif, whispering through the widening cracks in his sanity while also foreshadowing his eventual mental collapse. If we allow the metaphorical murder from verse 1 to persist, then "I don't want to die" can be read as poor boy's desire for a last-minute retreat back into the social camouflage of his living lie, just as his desire for unbirth is a retreat back into a worry-free state of non-existence. As the criminal goes on trial and the outcast ventures into society, let's see how things continue to unfold in the song's famous interlude.
I see a little silhouette of a man. Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? Thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening me.
Galileo, Galileo, Galileo Figaro.
Magnifico!
I'm just a poor boy, nobody loves me.
He's just a poor boy from a poor family. Spare him his life from this monstrosity.
Easy come, easy go, will you let me go?
Bismillah, no, we will not let you go. Let him go. Bismillah, no, we will not let you go. Let him go. Bismillah, no, we will not let you go.
Not let you go, let me go. Never let you go, let me go.
Never, never, never let me go. No, 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 no.
Oh, mamma mia, mamma mia.
Mamma mia, let me go. Beelzebub has a devil put aside for me, for me, for me.
If playing an exhilarating game of ping pong with your eardrums is not excitement enough, how about playing that game of ping pong at an ear-popping altitude atop a mountain of obscure references? If you want to make the breakdown of this part a whole lot easier, be sure to pause and briefly look over these thumbnail definitions of all the words in the interlude you've heard but never cared to look up because, let's face it, this part is so awesome that even if I were being smothered to death beneath the jiggly hind parts of a heavyweight sumo wrestler, and
I see a little silhouette of a man. Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango?
swelled through the nearest loudspeaker, I would devote my last muffled breath to the words, "Ooh, Queen." So where were we? Oh, you got the definitions? Okay, good. As musically dizzying as this part is, lyrically, it's little more than an especially theatrical trial, with some voices arguing for compassion and leniency, and others arguing for the letter of the law. It's the perfect marriage of content and form with the pounding polyphony and contrapuntal chaos, simulating the thunder and lightning of intense debate between the powerless defense and an impassioned prosecution. It's in making sense of the English, Italian, Arabic code mixing that we are gifted with a truckload of evidence that the persecution angle is a fruitful one indeed. With the low silhouetto lighting replete with cliche thunder and lightning backdrop, evoking a sense much more akin to Pit and the Pendulum than an episode of Law and Order, Poor Boy's inquisitors ask if Scaramouche will do the fandango. Or in terms more familiar, will you, the stock Spanish character, do your predictable Spanish dance? It's probably no accident that playing a role and doing a dance are common metaphors for playing along with society's expectations. So will you wipe that ridiculous white paint off your face and go study for the SAT? Next, we have a kind of invocation that combines the figures of Galileo, history's prime example of a truth seeker unjustly accused, with the barber of Seville's Figaro, a skilled and clever character who nevertheless finds himself in a subordinate position. As much as it might seem otherwise, Poor Boy has not suddenly been possessed by a demon with a fondness for all things Italian. The polymath turned heretic Galileo, a titan in the history of science, is also a powerful symbol of society's inability to swallow or even entertain an inconvenient truth. With a scowling tribunal of talking hoods that will not let him go on one side, we have on the other side of the debate those who wish to spare him his life from this monstrosity, literally being rescued from the monstrous prospect of imprisonment and or execution, sounds at the allegorical level an awful lot like the good intentions of those more nurturing members of society that would see Poor Boy's antisocial proclivities buried beneath a mound of medication, his Galileo-like commitment to the truth conceived as a monster to be suppressed or slain. The references to Italian literature and history, especially the heretical Galileo, juxtaposed with the Arabic Bismillah, all embedded within the context of a trial, irresistibly conjures a Crusade-era dichotomy of Christian versus heathen, as directed by a much younger Catholic Church, which is, from a historical perspective, Western civilization's capital P persecutors par excellence. With only the vaguest knowledge of church history as prerequisite, one needn't hear Galileo in a piercing falsetto, nor Bismillah in a rumbling baritone, to get that this is no mere rebuke, but a forced conversion, not a trial before the guardians of justice, but a farcical hearing within the kangaroo court of the social inquisition. Is it any wonder, then, that Poor Boy's final appeal to mercy has him conceiving of himself as the prized gimp in Beelzebub's private slave auction? While I wouldn't argue that the text has narrowed its focus to religious persecution, religion nevertheless functions powerfully as metaphor, since we often regard even the most secular of social norms with all the fear and trembling of commandments etched in stone. Whatever your precise interpretation of the interlude, it makes skull-rendingly clear that there is much more at stake here than the fate of a single murderer. The trial, for us outside the story world, represents the all too familiar prattle that every sect of society, whether they have a personal stake in the issue or not, tends to produce whenever some new social phenomenon rears its head. The interlude is a musical reenactment of the voices of condemnation and criminalization, bashing with white-knuckled fury against voices that would seek to quote-unquote save the socially depraved from themselves. If the evidence was scant so far that Rhapsody should be approached as a parable, the interlude sends a signal comparable to Orwell shaving a picture of Joseph Stalin into Napoleon's hide. Slipping out of his murderous persona for much of the interlude, Poor Boy punches Hulk style through the figurative wall between fiction and reality, practically smashing us over the head with the story's me against the world theme. As we limp exhausted and half dead towards the song's end, rest assured that more easily digestible analysis waits to treat our wounds on the other side.
So you think you can stone me and spit in my eye? So you think you can love me and leave me to die? Oh, baby, can't do this to me, baby. Just gotta get out, just gotta get right out of here. To me, anyway the wind blows.
Whereas Poor Boy stood quivering and helpless before the prosecution, time spent in what must be a cell has turned powerlessness into wrath. His two leading rhetorical questions mark a drastic shift in tone in which he finally ceases his pity party and instead starts to curse the stones and spit of his oppressors. This is not the same beat dog we saw earlier in the song, as the simple act of describing his ordeal in terms of thrown rocks and weaponized saliva, methods of punishment as barbaric today as they were at the time of the song's writing, reveals that he has reclaimed the moral high ground, if only in his own head. Also noteworthy is the shift in listener, with Poor Boy adding a lover to his long list of betrayers. We might picture Poor Boy seething with rage and resentment, while his former lover and the neighborhood handyman engage in gross acts of PDA on the other side of the plexiglass. I mean, who could blame her? Have you seen those biceps? Poor Boy then announces his intention to escape from prison, which he must have, because how else did he get to this bus stop? Speaking of the narrative present, the song's final lines bring us full circle back to its philosophical prologue. For our allegorical reading, this angriest part of the song represents the point of self-justification. The persecuted comes to the realization that he lives in a culture of stone-throwing projectile droolers, and that a brighter day must certainly lay on the horizon. Though why he conceives of this culture of projectile droolers in terms of a lover is anyone's guess.
Oh, baby.
This would be an empowering end for Poor Boy if in fact it was the end, which it isn't. Poor Boy is with us on this bench, spouting off a bunch of nihilistic nonsense. He reached the end of his quest only to find out that the princess will forever be deferred to another castle. It seems that the song's final lesson is not to
let it go, let it go.
When all the cool kids at the castle just can't handle the fact that your ice powers have hit the level cap. As this text would have it, and I'm inclined to agree, human beings just aren't made for the hermitage on the remote mountaintop. The human mental life can never be totally between you and God, so to speak, as even religious revelation must be, or quickly become, communal if it is to ever be counted as a religion at all. Our personal identities are so intimately tied to the approval and ratification of a larger community that without some sort of social stability, we are reduced to a grain grain of dirt in a cosmic landslide, subject to the ever-shifting winds of whim. We look to the sky for some heavenly inheritance, only to find that we are all just celestial poor boys. Without some form of social insulation, we're forced to own the fact that each of us is, on our own, the cosmic little man. If enough people tell the mime that this is no country for painted-faced fools, then you leave him with no other option than to become the Joker. At which point, there is no difference for him between giving that beautiful lapel flower a sniff and using it as an acid delivery system, between the reality of your moral worth and dignity and his fantasy of what you look like without your skin. Make no mistake, from an allegorical perspective, this is a cautionary parable of persecution bookended by its nasty end result. And yet the power of an allegorical approach to this song lies not in what it reveals about nihilism, which is frankly next to nothing, but what it expresses about the experience of persecution. Though a good half of the world has it much worse, Americans are all about some persecution. When our wrong-headed bigotry doesn't have us taking the scourge to the bare back of the other, our savior complexes have us draping our favorite mink coats around the shivering shoulders of this week's charity case, just in time for the passerby paparazzi to get it all on their phone. We are increasingly becoming a land of rebels ready to rappel heroically onto the roof of the latest social revolution with only the vaguest notion of where the train's headed. But Rhapsody as allegory isn't too keen on fleeting political particulars. Rather, the text is much more geared toward the felt realities of persecution. Thankfully, it offers no clear advice on who we should be dragging behind our pickup trucks, nor does it clue us in as to what pretends he's a 6-year-old girl amorphous life form we should be coating in wax and lauding as the next stage of human evolution. Despite Poor Boy's insistence that he doesn't need it, the final effect of this reading is ultimately one of sympathy for our persecuted narrator, and, one would hope, for any and all persecuted people. Sympathy that the song coaxes out of us, regardless of our ethnic, cultural, sexual, or ideological orientation. Maybe music really can bring the world together.
Oh, no, no, no.